we were talking about on kingship last time, and I wanted to finish that up, and then next week we will deal with Aquinas' views in the Summa. We're going to spend more time on Aquinas than a lot of the other thinkers because Aquinas is so important. And so in the Summa he develops this natural law ideas. But in On Kingship we still have a few points to make. He has taken a lot from Aristotle, and that's what I tried to emphasize last time we met, all the ways in which we see the great influence of Aristotle in Aquinas' thought. But then, as a Christian thinker, he has to deviate from Aristotle to a certain extent, and today we'll look at some of the ways in which he does. He does question the old value of earthly glory or pride. It comes through even in Aristotle. So, first of all, what does motivate rulers to rule well, in your view? What makes a leader, whether it's like President Obama or a king, any kind of ruler, what motivates them to rule well if they do? Or try anyway. Yeah.
The continuation of their regime, their leadership.
Okay, so that would be about self-interest, right? They want to keep it going. Okay. Anything else motivate them?
I'd say like probably also a genuine love for their country, or you would want them to rule well. Like just they don't want to see their country go down.
Yeah, at least some of them, yeah, would come from that perspective of wanting to support their country because they love it, right? Anything else?
They want to make history.
Hey, absolutely, fame, right? I mean, that's an incredible lure, and it was the primary lure, I think, in the ancient world was fame, status, glory, right? But even in modern times, put yourself in the position of somebody who might become president of the United States. Okay? To think that, I mean, there would be, hopefully, love of country might be a motivation, but there's always going to be that, oh my God, I'm going to be one of these people who's going to be remembered forever. And of course, it comes with a lot of responsibility. Once the person gets that, then they realize, I'll be remembered forever for both good and ill, right? Puts a lot of pressure on them, and that's lots of times why you see them age in office so dramatically, I think, is the amount of responsibility they feel. So we've talked about self-interest, right? And the idea of glory or fame. And maybe love of country could be condensed into patriotism or something like that. Right? Now, in contrast to that, which I think all of those responses are really quite good, they're realistic, what would somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas say should motivate? What ought to motivate a leader to be a good leader?
That the well-being of the people.
Okay, he definitely says that, right? The good of the people.
And then maybe like obeying, like religion, like being like close to your religion.
Okay. Maybe obeying God, because God would, God's wishes are that you take care of other people. Okay. Anything else? Anybody want to add? So you see, there's quite a difference in motivation, isn't there? If we try to think as Aquinas would, or through a very strictly a Christian lens, okay, we think differently, and certainly the welfare or good of the people would be foremost in mind, because there's this, commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. There's this idea of, taking care of your fellow man, right? And also just, and people are different on this score. Some people who do good things are motivated mainly by love for others, and some people are motivated more by duty. This is the way I'm supposed to act, I love God, therefore I will do these things because he tells me I should. So maybe both of those. Now, just kind of keep in mind how different that really is from not only the ancient pagan perspective. Think of, Homer's Achilles. Okay? Now, if you've ever read the Iliad, you know that Achilles is a mixed character. He's, even for, I think, Homer and the people listening to the story, Achilles was maybe not perfect, okay? Because he was very angry at the Greeks, remember that story? And as a result, he refused for a long time to fight the Trojans. And it seemed like mainly that was about himself, not being fully respected by King Agamemnon. Right? And so he refused to fight, and a lot of people got sick, a lot of people died as a result of that before he finally relented. But yet still in that story, the overall thrust seems to be Achilles is a heroic, admirable figure. In the ancient view, altruism really wasn't even on the radar screen. The idea that you self-sacrifice for other people. It was perfectly legitimate to want glory and to think primarily of oneself. If Achilles was as great a fighter and as great a character as Homer made him out to be, then he was perfectly deserving of great fame and glory and all the different war prizes that he wanted and so forth. And so, for the most part, Achilles is an admirable character in the Iliad. Whereas from the Christian perspective, how would we view somebody like Achilles who decided not to fight for his country because somebody had personally insulted him and allowed his fellow soldiers to bear the brunt as a result?
Prideful.
Yeah, I mean that's a gross sin of pride. He's incredibly prideful. He appears, and oftentimes when I teach this, I teach it in the primary text core course. The initial reaction is Achilles is a spoiled, brat. He pouts, he cries, he rages about himself and so forth. He has no self-control. He's incredibly selfish. He doesn't think about anybody else. And all of those comments come from the filter of Christianity. Even when people aren't Christians in the Western world, they've absorbed this idea that a good person cares more about others than he does about himself, or is willing to sacrifice himself for others, and is a good team player, so to speak, when it comes to his fellow man. And so from our perspective, Achilles is not heroic, really, or he's very problematic in his heroism. We can recognize that he's a great warrior, and he's got a lot of courage in battle. Okay, that's admirable, but what he uses it for is not admirable. Okay, so we get that from this long embrace of the Christian worldview, basically. It's changed our perspective. And so even for people who are not Christians or are marginally Christian in their orientation, they still admire somebody who's humble. Today's hero tends to be somebody who is willing to say, no, don't look at me. I'm, Captain Sully, for instance, I did what I did because I needed to, but don't look at me, look at these causes that I'm espousing and so forth. He's not trying to grab fame. And if he did, we'd probably think, God, what an arrogant bastard, he is. So, very, very different point of view. And I put this up here because even Aquinas' secular teacher, Aristotle, or his pagan teacher, I should say, Aristotle, had this ideal of magnanimity. The magnanimous man was somebody who was truly great, because truly talented, truly capable of great things, knew it, and was generous with his talents, abilities, and his possessions, and so forth. Okay? And was worthy and wanted praise. Okay? A magnanimous man is admirable because he knows he's great and is willing to do great things with what he's got. Okay? Now, again, from Aquinas' perspective and later, that's a tad bit arrogant, to say, yes, I am talented, and because I am, I'll bestow my gifts upon the community. you know, and thank you very much for your thanks because I deserve it, you know. I mean, you might think those things, but it's not a good idea to say them, is it? Then you get put in the category of arrogant jerk, and people don't want to deal with you. Okay? So we see with Aquinas a characteristic that just keeps getting stronger in the Western mentality of basically rejecting the glory-seeking, the honor-seeking, the magnanimous man as too arrogant, as not humble enough. And this is problematic for Western society because then if we aren't strongly motivated by religion, then to do good things for the community, then we may not have any other motivation if we rejected honor and glory seeking. This is what I'm working on in my own scholarship. So, but we see with Aquinas this characteristic. He says the good king ought not to look to earthly things for his reward, like what kind of worldly or earthly things might a king get as a reward for his being a good ruler? Okay, money, right? Lots of, wealth. What was that? Yeah, right. Praise from people, recognition.
That dragon.
Even that, maybe if he could find one, or whatever else he could find. That's right. So, such a person would have lots of good things surrounding him to show how great he is. And Aquinas says, no, that's not the proper motivation, and that's not what a good leader ought to want, not any of those things, right? But should realize that God supplies the reward, and basically the reward comes in the next life. He says the reward of virtue is happiness, but it's not necessarily happiness in this life, or if it is, it's just the contentment of knowing, the hope that the leader has that his good deeds will be rewarded in the next life. But true happiness comes in the next life. Okay? To that extent, he sounds like Augustine, who says the same thing. True happiness only comes with God's reward. And you run the race and you do the best you can, and you hope that you will be rewarded, but you do so with humility, understanding that you have a lot of imperfections, that you haven't done everything right, and that you ultimately have to trust in God's justice, right? Now, why would this promise of happiness in the next life, why or how could this possibly appeal to a powerful earthly ruler, then or now? I mean, would this be a good enough thing to say to somebody who is either running for office or is about to ascend to the throne, to say, well, do what you do for the sake of, happiness in the next life? Do you think that would have much appeal?
I think so, because they pretty much already have a lot of stuff given to them.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think you could say that to anyone, because most people didn't live very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the, reason why? I mean, it seems kind of fatalistic.
Yeah. Well, it kind of depends upon the person, right? But the person's character would be very important in this case, as to whether this would appeal to him or not, right? And for a lot of them, it would be mixed. It might appeal to a person somewhat, but it would be difficult for them to filter out all these other motivations too. And so Aquinas is basically trading practicality for what he considers to be the truth here, and he's trying to appeal to Christian rulers in particular, I think, to remember their belief system. In other words, to try to, as much as possible, filter out the worldly motivations that may lead them from being able to really think about the common good, and try to focus in on the religious motivations, in which case they can be more self-sacrificing and they can be more dedicated to their people. But it's a tough appeal, it really is. He says on 108, nothing permanent is found in earthly things, and therefore There is nothing earthly that can quiet desire. Okay? So this should remind you of the Platonic argument about, you know, how desires are endless. So he uses that to kind of try to tell the ruler, well, look, you may think that you want all of these things, money, the dragon, you know, whatever it is that you want, but frankly, you'll never have enough. So this really isn't the best of motivations. Okay? It'll just make you want more and more and more, and you won't be able to be happy. He also says, trying to appeal, ironically, to the king's sense of importance, he says, there's no earthly thing which is able to make kings happy, nor is any earthly thing a sufficient reward for a king. Okay? You have a lot of things. I mean, how many times have we seen this? Really wealthy people who are unhappy. It actually doesn't make people happy. They think it's going to make them happy, but it may be neutral, but it doesn't seem to matter too much. They just seem to be as capable of unhappiness as anybody else. Bad things happen to them, family problems happen to them, you know, and sometimes it makes things worse, you know, because it involves them in corruption, or it involves them in, you know, fending off other people, or not knowing whether their relationships are genuine and so forth. But here he's basically saying, if you're a king, then you should want the ultimate reward, you know, which is not here in this world. None of these things are worthy of a true king, of a good king, but rather that other worldly reward is more suitable. Now, a Christian king who's well motivated might at least try to embrace that concept. And I think that's what Aquinas is aiming at, is getting that person to think, okay, yes, according to my belief system, okay, this is true, and therefore, you know, this is what I should aim at. On a daily basis, constantly embracing that would be admittedly difficult. All right, so there's that teaching that comes out here, and that is contrary to Aristotle, okay? Because Aquinas focuses so much more on the self-sacrificing, and that comes from the, you know, particularly the Christian lens. Okay? And this is another area where there seems to be some disagreement. Okay, now first I do say he agrees with Aristotle that the greatest worldly good is friendship. Okay, but then he disagrees about what this means or how to pursue it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about friendship. Aristotle had a lot to say about friendship. You didn't read it, but there's, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, there's a great deal of material on friendship. And he's got all sorts of criteria. But first, let's talk about our criteria. Okay, when you're trying to figure out whether a person's a friend or not, or how much of a friend you want them to be, what are your criteria? A lot of us haven't thought enough about this, I have to say. So this might be a little bit hard in a way, but do you have criteria for your friendships?
Do they have something to offer in return?
Okay, do they have something to offer? What kind of thing? Can you give me an example?
Say, like, you're good at math and he's good at biology, and so you tutor each other.
Okay, like helping each other, trading expertise. Okay.
Common interests.
Okay. Yep. It doesn't work too well if you're into completely different things, does it? Because then it's hard to find things to do. I do have an old friend like that who really, she's older than I am. She's like 65 or something like that. She's in her mid-60s. But she still likes going dancing and going and having a drink at the bar. And I just really don't. I don't like doing either one of those things. I like, you know, watching movies, or I don't know, going out to eat. And I don't mind having a drink, but not at a bar. And she just doesn't want it. It seems like every time we try to figure out something to do, we end up maybe going to a park or something like that, because we're trying to find common ground. And you know, she likes sporting events. I don't. You know, we're just kind of different. But I've known her for a long time, so we try pretty hard to find something to do, and we consider each other good friends for other reasons, but not because of common interests. But that really is it's pretty important if you're going to enjoy your friend on a regular basis. Any other criteria? Mm-hmm.
Trust.
Okay, yeah. Right, if that person, how many of you would drop a friend if they did something patently untrustworthy towards you? Okay. If you didn't raise your hand, you should probably rethink that. Because, quite frankly, once you're sure, and some people have trouble with seeing what's in front of their eyes, but once you're sure that this person's untrustworthy, there's really no point in having them as a friend. You just need to face it and move on. Okay? But people will try to talk themselves out of, oh, it's really not that bad, or it's just this one time, or whatever. But, you know, if they steal your homework or, you know, take your paper and use it without your permission, hopefully, or something like that, and it harms you in particular, if it harms you, then you know they're not a friend. So trust is pretty important. Yeah.
I don't think this would be like a basis for all friendship, but for like the closest ones, like loyalty, just like having people like that who have got you.
Got your back?
Right.
Absolutely. That's the basis of the friendship with the woman I don't have much in common with. Otherwise, is that I know for sure that if I had a problem, she would be there, and if she has a problem, I will be there. Absolutely. It's like a pact, basically. And we've both tested that within the last couple of years, and it's rock solid. So what we have in common is core values, and because of that, we know the other person will be there if we need them. But we still struggle with how to get together. So, yeah, loyalty. Okay, anything else? Anybody want to add?
Admiration of character or a person's goodness.
Okay.
They're just really nice guys. You don't even know them.
There's some hot friendships.
So by admiration of character, do you mean like their moral character?
Yeah,
or?
like they're like a really outstanding kind of person. It's like I really like him, so I want to get to know him and be his friend only on the basis of their character.
Okay.
Physical prowess.
Yeah. I'm not saying anything about that.
Tying in with that one, somebody you can do stupid things with.
Okay.
That's always, I mean,
Yeah.
nobody wants to
Well,
do
that would
stupid
tie
stuff.
back into, kind of back into this, like if you like rowing a lot,
Yeah.
you'd want to get somebody who can do that too, or if you like fishing a lot, you wouldn't want some
Skipping through the meadows.
Who, her?
Okay.
Why are you pointing at me for?
I've seen you prance.
You know, I mean, I guess I would put that into common interest. Yeah.
Another one would be like history, not so much like time-wise, but quality time. The more quality you have, somebody,
Okay.
I think it makes it stronger.
So, I mean, history and experience of the person, I mean, just being around them enough to really get to know them, that can definitely help solidify. And that runs also back into character. And what Aristotle does is he basically says there's different types of friends. There's different degrees of friends. There are friends who just are fun, okay? And all you do is your common interests. And you don't really rely on them. There's no real loyalty issue or trust issue there because you're not relying on them. You might just go, you know, you both are good at a particular game or something like that, so you get together and you do that. But he calls those more or less friends of convenience, right? Whereas a deeper friendship requires some of these other things that you mentioned, the character, the trust, the loyalty. And what he emphasizes the most is that the characters be common, or what we would now call shared values, okay? That you both agree on basic values, okay? Which creates a closeness, which creates proper trust and loyalty. Because let's face it, I mean, two criminals can be loyal to each other, right? I think we just probably saw that in action. You know, those two brothers were probably very loyal. In fact, they're speculating that the older brother led the younger brother into this terrorist mentality, perhaps. So there was probably a lot of loyalty between the two, but neither one of them were good people. So in order to have a proper, valuable friendship, it has to be between two people with shared values that are good, right? That are proper. And he also says you have to be together enough, which might be a problem for me and my friend, maybe once every 2 or 3 months. So, but you know, a lot of these things he does recognize as important, though. I mean, it's important, not as important as sharing values, but it is important for maintaining a friendship, that you have some common interests, that you can do some things together, that you like seeing this person on a regular basis. Okay? So, having said all that, I think it sounds to me like your common notion of what makes a friend, if we collected all these ideas together, is somewhat like Aristotle's. It's pretty practical, okay? And you do recognize that the closer friend is somebody that you can actually, that you have some sort of real connection with and a bond, right? But Aquinas focuses on a different type of friendship. He does kind of change the treatment of friendship from the more practical and Aristotelian view to the Christian view. Does anybody remember, or maybe just think about how friendship might change if we took a look at it through a purely Christian lens?
Self-sacrifice.
Okay.
Pretty big, or loyalty.
Well, you know, self-sacrifice for sure, okay? Because the friendship that you have with another person would, through this Christian perspective, would be displayed through what you could do for that person, right? And to not be selfish with them. Okay. Anything else that might change?
A lot more faith-based.
Definitely. You know, and that means that you basically obey God's law or God's will in your relationships with other people, right? If it's faith-based, it's not so much about what you feel, it's about what you think God wants. And this does change the treatment of friendship quite a bit. In fact, what Aquinas does is he melds friendship into really Christian love. Okay, and he's focusing in, of course, on the ruler's friendship with the people, so to speak. So we don't get a full-fledged treatment of what we've been talking about, person-to-person friendship. But I think that we can extrapolate a little bit from this treatment what he would say. But he talks about how a ruler's friendship needs to involve that self-sacrifice. And it should be mutual, because the ruler should be giving his people what they need. They should also love him and give him what he needs. Okay? So he needs to rule with benevolence, thinking only of his people's welfare. Now, is he going to know most of them? Is he going to know personally most of these people? He can never do that. Okay? Even in a small kingdom, it's impossible. But the larger, the more difficult it is. Most of these people will live and die, and he'll never know who they are. But he's still got to love them by being a good ruler, by creating good policies, good laws, by being just. Okay? That's a very different type of friendship than the type of friendship we just got done talking about. Okay? And this question of Christian love and how different it is from friendship, from Aristotelian friendship, gets even more complicated when you add this commandment to love your enemy and do good to those who treat you badly. Okay? The Christian perspective is to love everybody. And why is that? Does anybody know? What's the reason why a Christian is supposed to love everybody, regardless of, say, who they are, what they do, etc.
God loves everybody.
Yeah, that's it. You know, God created the world. God created human beings. He loves everybody. Okay? Have you ever heard the phrase love the person but hate the sin, or hate the sin but love the sinner? Okay, that's an expression of this type of this view. Okay, and it's because God loves them and you love God, therefore you love these people, even those who hurt you, even those who don't pay attention to you, even those who are at war with you. Okay. Very, very different. Because Aristotle would say you have no obligation to be friends with somebody who's your enemy or who's a bad person, who's trying to do you harm or ignoring you, etc. For Aristotle, friendship is a mutual thing. Okay? And so really, Aquinas is talking about something quite different here. He calls it friendship, but it's really Christian love. And it's a much more universalistic type of concept. Okay? Maybe it can be summed up in the word charity. Maybe that's a better term. And I've heard people say who have trouble with this idea of loving your enemy or loving everybody regardless if you know them, is to think in terms of love as charity, the charitable attitude, you know, of wanting to help and do good to everyone because God commands it. So what is so challenging about this type of love? How can this type of love be problematic? And how might somebody, especially in a position of power, say, I don't know, this doesn't sound like something I can do? What are some problems that emerge when people try to love this universalistically or care about people in this way, regardless of their character, their actions, etc.?
They get taken advantage of.
Okay, there's that, right? Is that what you're going to say too? Yeah. So they may become victims because they try to do the right thing and they try to see the good in the other person. And that other person may not change at all, and they may just take advantage of that. Yeah, I've certainly seen that a lot. And what happens? What's the really purely Christian response to that, to being taken advantage of?
Turn the other cheek.
Yeah, turn the other cheek. Now, when it comes to foreign policy and warfare, the Catholic Church did, as we've discussed a little bit already, formulate the just war concept, which is a little, goes beyond turn the other cheek, right? But it's still, even within the just war doctrine, you see a strong emphasis on desiring peace, on forgiving, on no revenge, only fight when you absolutely have to protect other people, but you should not make people pay just for the sake of doing so, etc. So, yes, turning the other cheek, which you've got to really keep your eye on the afterlife, right? You have to really think that this life is not as important as the afterlife, to consistently keep your eye on that in order to risk becoming a victim and to find that acceptable. You really have to fully embrace that, that really heaven is your reward. And this is difficult for everybody who tries to follow that path. Probably the most difficult thing for a lot of people, myself included, I would say, is to do that. People question it their whole lives. How am I supposed to love other people if they're bad people? Do I have to feel something? Well, the answer to that seems to be no, you don't. You just have to do it anyway because that's God's will. But most people will tell you you don't have to feel it. All right, so anyway, it's a tall order because it can be very problematic. And it can get you into a lot of trouble. And especially for a political leader dealing, like Machiavelli says, with so many unscrupulous leaders, it's more likely that something will go wrong. Okay? And we will be looking more at the development of just war theory, a sort of response to that a country can't leave itself wide open to any and all enemies in the way that an individual can if they want to. The country can't, because by doing so, the leader risks so many other people's lives. So, Aquinas does observe with Aristotle that the benevolent relationship is not only right relative to Christian love, but is also beneficial to the ruler. So he tries to tie it up. Remember that discussion of tyranny? And he goes into the tyrannical practices and how the tyrant hangs on to power. The overall message of that is that if you go down the path of tyranny, not only will you be a sinner and you forego your otherworldly reward, but quite practically speaking, you're likely to end up in a bad way on earth too. That there are worldly consequences for tyranny as well. Either people will revolt, or people will be poor. They will hate you. All of those reasons we've already learned actually from the ancients, about the impracticality of tyranny. So he does come back with that more practical, this worldly argument as well. So the king's got two reasons to avoid tyranny. One is if he's a Christian, he should adhere to the Christian, truth that, you love you love everybody and you try to do the best that you can to provide for people and to give them what they need. But also you do it because to be a tyrant is likely to end up making you feel the pain in this life. Okay? So remember, this is a mirror book. He's writing this particular book on kingship aimed directly at rulers. And he's trying to give them reasons, and these would be Christian rulers, okay, for why they should do well and not be greedy, not be selfish, not be tyrannical. Now, another area where there's some change between Aquinas and Aristotle is in this area of what promotes the good life. Aquinas agrees that the best government promotes the good life, okay? But let's think for a moment about what was the good life for Aristotle, okay? First of all, what government promoted the best life in Aristotle's view?
Polity.
Right, polity. And why did polity provide the best life for people?
For political animals.
Right, we're political animals, so a government that doesn't provide most people with the ability to be citizens in a true sense cannot be the best form of government, because if you can't be an active citizen, you can't really explore who you are as a political animal. You can't really live that life. So he advocated for polity, that mixed regime in which ordinary citizens have a voice in their government, and in which the interests of the rich are balanced against the interests of the majority. Okay? Now, having said that the good life for Aristotle is that of citizenship. Okay? Would somebody like Aquinas, from a purely Christian perspective in this case, would he agree that citizenship is the highest calling and the best government is that which promotes it? No. So what would he say? I mean, what's the best life, first of all, for Aquinas as opposed to Aristotle?
One where you serve God
Yeah.
and everything.
Right. Being a Christian, being one who actually is able to access Christian doctrine, is really able to live the Christian life. So it's the Christian life, which doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't at all necessitate active citizenship. Okay, there's no connection there. There's no necessary connection there. And he doesn't make one. And actually, he's previously said that the most natural and best form of government is the rule of one, the king, as long as that king is benevolent. So he does consider polity as an option, but it's not the best. If you have a benevolent ruler, that's better. Okay? And it's better because it follows closely, it mirrors the relationship between God and man. And if the king can represent God and God's will best and foster that in the people, then he's the best choice. Okay? So he goes into some treatment of what the king should do, right, in this regard, promoting the good life. Okay? And he says he should set the context in which the people can aim at the good life in the world to come, because it's truly, the Christian life in this world is flawed, but the aim is the good life in the next world. Okay? So a good king tries to set this context in which they can pursue salvation. Okay? But he says, interestingly, that is really the priest's area. The priest's purview is to, give people the teachings that they need to eventually receive their heavenly reward. Okay, so he makes a little bit of a distinction here. He does not say, so the king should force people to attend church, or the king should, pass laws making it mandatory that everybody be a member of the church, or anything like that. Okay, he simply says that's the priest's purview. So you have to assume that the king, a good Christian king, allows the church to do what it does. Okay, sort of creates a context in which it can operate effectively, but doesn't try to force people with its sword to do what they need to do. So what does he do? Well, Aquinas gives us 3 ways, and I'll just go ahead and put them up and keep them up there. There are 3 things that the king needs to provide to create this context, and they're all quite practical and worldly things in and of themselves, but they create a context in which the priests can operate, in which the religious side can do its job effectively, and the people are more or less receptive. Okay? So, one is security, establishing in a unity of peace, established in unity of peace, meaning they must be peaceful amongst each other. He has to, in other words, provide good law and order. Okay? So he agrees with Augustine there. He has to also create security from enemies from without. So he recognizes that. And that kind of modifies the sort of extreme turn your other cheek. Aquinas does begin the development of just war theory. We'll look at that next week. Okay? So he's got to do that, because unless people live in peace, if they're constantly feeling under threat from each other within society and from external enemies, it's not a proper context for them developing their spiritual lives, obviously. When people are necessitated by survival to do things that they shouldn't do. Secondly, the multitude must be directed towards good deeds, and he interprets this as passing good laws. Okay? So these laws should discourage bad behavior, including immoral behavior. So you would have laws about marriage, for instance, and the violation of marriage, and about stealing, and about murder and lying, and all of those things in the 10 Commandments. There would be laws against those types of things, and rewards for virtuous work. So there's the carrot and the stick. Right? And finally, he says the multitude must be supplied with things required for proper living. So he needs to provide rewards for hard work, discouraging laziness, which means the economy. You have to create, the ability for people, if they work hard, to make money, to be able to survive and thrive and have the proper incentives. You need to encourage learning and make learning as widespread as possible. And you have to provide charity. So he does think that this is part not just for the church to do, but also for the state, to make sure that those who are indigent, those who are handicapped, too old, somehow get the help that they need. Because in a good society, you don't let people just fend for themselves. There has to be some support. A lot of that would be run through the church, but it's kind of interesting that he puts it under the purview also of the king. That's part of his concern. Okay? So if the king supplies these things well, then he's done his job. Okay, this is his job. And he's created the context in which the church can freely take care of spiritual matters. and he's created a people who will be receptive to that approach, okay?